This video is the second part in my series about making an embroidered jacket, and I'm going to focus on how I made the corset. I chose to make the corset first because I knew that I wanted a low neckline on the smock, and with the corset already made I could make the necklines as close as possible to each other. In the first video, I did all the research for all the pieces I'm going to make already, so if you're interested in that video, I'll link it below. I knew I wanted to make an exact replica, so I've decided to just copy out the pattern from Patterns of Fashion. So I'm just going to copy the shapes exactly. And to make the pattern, I just draft it on one of my dolls, but this doll, she's a drafting doll. Which is kind of sad because she doesn't really have a face. But she does have embroidered lines down the front and the back to help guide me on where I want to put the pattern. So when I'm making a pattern, I'll pin pieces of fabric onto the doll, and I normally start in the centre. Whether it's the front or back, it doesn't really matter. And you can see here that I've drawn a line at the waist because I know that's where the main part of the pattern on this corset stops, and then the tabs will start. And then I'll add another piece of fabric and start on the front piece. This corset pattern's quite easy because it only has two main pieces, and then you can pin those in and then line it up, and it will meet with the other pieces of the pattern, and then you can see I've drawn lines to guide me to make sure that they actually match. But I've actually left a bit of a gap here because when you sew the patterns often, as you can see in the book, will be quite spaced apart at the bottom, but they always meet at the top under the arm, and then I can take the patterns off and start making paper ones. After drawing out the pattern on the fabric, I stitched the outlines so that later on, when I had layers of fabric on top, I could see the outline. It was a bit time consuming, but it was worth it in the end. When you're making a corset, the conventional method would be to stitch the boning channels and then add the boning afterwards, but when it's this small, it's really not possible. So I've kind of adapted my own way of making boning for corsets by using string, which I've dipped in glue and then let dry. And I've stitched this to the fabric, and you kind of get the best of both worlds because it's a lot more flexible, but it's a lot stronger than just string on its own. Also, on this pattern, I haven't drawn the boning channels, and I don't know why I didn't do that, but it would have made a lot more sense if I had, because it would have helped me guide the string. I used blue silk for the outer layer, and I'm glad I did in the end because it was really striking. Here you can see I'm using 2 layers of fabric to go on top, though I didn't really need 2 layers because it made it a lot more difficult to find the boning when I was stitching the layers on top. It would have been much better had I used that second layer underneath. It would have given it more stability, but it would have made it a lot easier for me. The first thing I do then is stitch the outline, and this is very basic because you're never going to see it. And then I stitch the boning channels, and with these I took a lot of time and effort so that they were all the same size and they were quite small, so it looked quite detailed. And while the pieces are still in the embroidery hoop, I decided to stitch on the back pieces. This was so I could stitch the buttonholes while they were still on the embroidery hoop. Normally you would leave this to the end of a project, but the tension from the embroidery hoop would just make it so much easier to stitch the buttonholes because they're so small. After I separate all the pieces, I trim down all the edges separately to avoid the edges fraying, especially considering there isn't a lot of space left. I then stitch along the edges to avoid fraying and also just neaten them up a bit. When I did this, you can see I'm only using 1 string of thread, and I don't know why, but it would have made a lot more sense if I'd used 2 or maybe even 3 or 4. And I'd come to realise this at the end when I was tidying up the edges with embroidery floss, and some bits were neater and some bits weren't so neat. On each piece of the corset where it had to join to another piece, I left the back layer open so that I could stitch down the folds and then stitch the pieces together. And finally, when all the pieces are together, I can fold down the fabric and stitch them in place. This is the final stage where I'm finishing the edges with embroidery floss. I think I'm using 2 pieces here, and it might have been better had I used more, though I think I was worried that it would look too clunky, especially the tabs at the bottom. So this is the final piece. I've left a lot of extra ribbon on the bottom because it's such a nightmare to get on and off, and the buttonholes are so tiny. In the next one, I'll be making the smock and the bum roll, so make sure you watch out for that one next week.